Okay, today we are talking about cultural criticism, and what I've decided to do for my class is I'm going to combine the entire week. So there's actually three lessons that in a normal class we would spread out over 3 days. Since they all sort of fit into the same model of cultural criticism, we're going to discuss all of it at once. I'm going to do the best I can to keep this relatively short. It's not going to be an hour and a half long. But this is our entire discussion on cultural criticism. At the end of this video, there will be a short explanation for your cultural myth paper. There are instructions on Canvas, but there'll be a small explanation in the last couple minutes here. Cultural criticism, we need to first start off with just what is culture, and you can go to my video on multiculturalism if you want some more information on this. I don't want to repeat myself too much where you can go and get other resources, but long story short, culture is essentially a shared system of values, beliefs, and attitudes. So anytime a large enough group of people sort of hold similar values, beliefs, and attitudes, they agree that certain behaviors are permissible. They have certain values and beliefs with regard to religion or politics, or how religion, politics, economics should run their culture, the society that they're in. You can say, okay, that's a culture, right? And you start to make distinctions between cultures. So one thing that you want to start thinking of is sort of what are some shared aspects of your culture. Now, when we get to this idea right here, this is one thing that I harp on especially hard when we talk about the Western canon in some of my courses. There are some people who have a problem with teaching the Western canon, or they critique the Western canon. And here's the thing, there's plenty to critique about things that are what we call canonical, right? The reason for teaching the values of a culture, or in the Western canon, so to speak, when we're talking about the humanities, is that even if you disagree with the values or the stories or sort of the canonical tenets of the culture, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn about them, because those canonical tenets are upholding, right? They're the foundation of your culture. So we get to some of these items, right? So you should read the Bible, right? I don't care what your religious beliefs are, or if you have no religious beliefs, but there's no denying that the Bible has foundational influence on Western culture, right? So you should read it to sort of understand what are the underpinnings, what are the foundations of the culture in which you're in. You should know a lot about capitalism, right? Because capitalism drives, well, for the most part, our global world now. But definitely Western culture, right? Ideas about traditional family and gender norms. So even though these things are stereotypical and you might think that they are outdated in some ways, it's like, well, you should still learn about them, because those were the underpinnings of family life for most cultures around the world, for most of human history. All right. So even if you don't agree, again, even if you don't agree with all the values of your culture, right, you should still understand what they are and where they come from, and you should read the books that influence them in order to sort of get to the underpinnings of where we're at now. All right, so don't be anti-intellectual, don't be culturally ignorant and say, well, you know what, the Bible is an outdated book, or I disagree with certain, I don't want to read Shakespeare because he was written 500 years ago, right? I want to avoid reading the sort of like canon of English literature because it's so old. I want to read the new stuff, right? Because it's more inclusive. The new stuff is more inclusive as far as who's able to write and who's allowed to speak in public spaces, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Shakespeare is a foundational writer who has shaped many of our stories for, almost 500 years now. So read the canonical text of your culture in order to understand, how did your culture get to 2020, for example? What were the foundational things that got us here that are influencing these, the cultural wars, if you call them, if you want to call them that? What are the things that we're having tensions over? The idea, what we're having tensions over is, what are the underpinning foundations of our culture? If people want us to progress past some of those things and sort of and move values, beliefs, and attitudes in a different direction, that's fine, but you need to first know where those values, beliefs, and attitudes came from. All right, so that's one of the major critiques I have of individuals who say, we don't need to read things from the past, right? We don't need some sort of what we call like the Western canon. We need it because we need to understand where all these things came from. Values are more or less deep beliefs of right and wrong. All right, so culture is simply a large group of people who share similar values and beliefs. I do have a video up on YouTube for a different course where I talk more in depth about the paradox of multiculturalism. Long story short is you can't support two opposing beliefs. So when people say we need to be inclusive and multicultural, if you start digging into it, it becomes difficult because at some level there are going to be foundational beliefs within a culture that are in contrast with one another. All right. So if people say, we need to be multicultural as far as, trying to learn other people's languages and try different foods and learn different dances, it's very sort of surface level ideas or practices. I'm all for that. But when you get into ideas of, if two different cultures have different norms and attitudes towards gender roles, sometimes those aren't compatible, right? If one culture says men and women are equal and another culture says, young girls should be pulled out of school at the age of 12 because the only thing that they need to learn is how to be a homemaker. Yeah, like at some point, those cultures are going to clash. So these are there's a lot of contradictions within the idea of multiculturalism. There's a lot of paradoxes within the idea of like, let's just hold up all beliefs equally all the time. The problem is that you can't. All right, so there are cultural ideas that clash. I go more in depth in a different YouTube video, but there you have it. All right, our values drive behavior, or at least they should drive behavior. And let's say that there are instances when you don't live up to your own values. So even though your values didn't sort of drive the behavior in which you engaged in what you might consider immoral behavior, the fact that you have certain values is going to make you feel guilty about engaging in such behavior. So one of the easiest ones to think about is something like, sex before marriage, whether or not that's permissible or not permissible. So let's say that you have a very religious view on, no sex before marriage. Great. Let's say you do partake in sex before marriage. So you can say, well, I acted against my value, but the fact that you have that value makes you feel guilty in some way, or makes you sort of rethink your decision about having sex before marriage. It makes you feel like, now you need to go confess, or you need to go talk to one of your friends, or you need to have some sort of, I don't know, mea culpa to, ask for forgiveness, what have you, right? So even in those moments when you act against your values are still driving your behavior because they're making you feel certain ways as far as guilt and shame, embarrassment, what have you, anytime you act against your values. So values are always influencing us even when we don't live up to them. Society as a whole uses sort of the larger cultural values to evaluate who is and who isn't a quote-unquote good citizen within the system. Some of the things that the textbook lays out for us, I do not know what page this is on. I had the page for the old edition. I don't have it for the new edition offhand. But long story short, when it comes to American values, some of the sort of general American values that the textbook lays out is when it comes to education, we usually value science as good. We do sort of hold education in high regard as far as formal education. So this idea of like everyone should go to college, or everyone should, finish high school. Everyone should get some sort of education. These are mantras that we constantly repeat. Economics, we like the idea of financial independence. So each individual should be able to take care of him or herself, and herself is important here, specifically in the aftermath of like second wave feminism, 1960s, 1970s. Like women should also be able to sort of maintain their sense of autonomy around finances, so they're not dependent on, let's say, an abusive husband, right? So if a woman needs to get out of a bad situation, she's financially independent and is able to do that, where if two people are tied together by finances, it's more difficult for someone to leave if it's an unhealthy relationship. We also value things like hard work, so you should go out and get your own paycheck. Don't worry, nobody else should be involved in, you upholding your own independence. Competition brings the best results for everyone. So things like, technology. So it's like Samsung and Apple iPhones are constantly struggling against each other in order to get better and better iPhones. Same things with cars, computers, what have you. So these are things we value as far as economics. Aesthetics, the United States, American culture is more into things, what we call the useful arts. So we do like aesthetics, but it's more around things like car designs. Like we want the best looking cars. We're really into interior decorating, fashion, etc. Now, this doesn't mean it's true for everybody. Again, we're speaking generally, where there are arts that are sort of like art for art's sake, right? Aesthetics for aesthetics sake. You make a beautiful painting, you put it on the wall. It's not functional in the same way a car is. It's not going to get you to work. But there are other cultures that just sort of value the purely aesthetic, surround your life with beauty more than the United States, right? We're more into things that are useful as opposed to things that are just sort of beautiful for the sake of being beauty. We value things like physical activity. When the book talks about music and literature, they're talking about, again, like canonical kind of stuff. So the classics. Social, we respect the idea of fairness and justice, or at least we say this a lot, and we'll talk about politicians here in a couple slides. Political, right? We're loyal to the community, right? Nation, individual sovereignty. And then, as mentioned on the last slide, religion is sort of Judeo-Christian values that you might hear a lot. And again, even if you disagree with the teachings of, it's hard to ignore the fact that Judeo-Christian values have been very influential in shaping culture. So you should learn about them, even if you don't agree with them. I'll continue to repeat this. Even if you don't agree with them, you should learn about them because they are very foundational to sort of how we got to where we are. And then once you learn about them, you're welcome to say, okay, we need to go in a different direction, or these things are outdated, or what have you, right? But it's hard to argue that these things weren't, that these values, these specific religious values aren't foundational in sort of creating our society. And you can do a compare and contrast kind of thing. So if you go over to India, it's like clearly like Hinduism is foundational, right, to India today, right? In the Middle East, right, like various nations where it's like Islam is very foundational to how they've created their culture, right? So learn about these different religions in order to better understand the cultures in which you're going into. Okay, we have two big ideas that we need to cover, right? Myths and fantasy themes. Myths are about the past, fantasy themes are about the future, right? And we create these myths and fantasy themes, and these are stories that we create, either stories about the past or stories and visions for the future that hold a society together. So if you want a society to have to hold together, right, to have some sort of glue to hold it together, you need shared myths, you need shared stories for the past, like how did we get here, and you need shared visions for the future, where are we going, right? So myths, they do a few different things. They provide a heightened sense of authority, so we like things like stable institutions, right? Everyone said, like, we need our institutions to hold, right? If there's a little bit of if the foundation starts to crack of our institutions, people start to get a little worried. Or it says, like, we like our stable institutions. However, sometimes we get a little too involved with, let's say, like, who the president is, right? It's like that's one person at the top of one institution. But if we have this sort of deep feeling like our institutions need to hold, it's like, well, why should our institutions be? Why are institutions so fragile that the election of like one person can screw all of them up? All right. So we need to make sure that we like the heightened sense of authority. We like stability. We like long-term stability, and if we tell ourselves these different types of stories, hopefully it holds society together. We like continuity, so the past connects us to the present and future. So an example of this would, people who are like very into DNA testing, like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. We like thinking that somehow our great-great-great-great-grandfather, the story of our family sort of has some influence on me today as far as, why is it that I, gravitate to certain literature, music, or movies, or, food choices or whatever. It makes us feel sort of connected back, if it's some sort of immigrant story or back to the motherland, wherever your family might be from. We have this interesting sense, we want this continuity, and even though if we kind of sit with it long enough, we sort of realize that, our great ancestors have very little to do with our day-to-day life. They don't influence us as much as we put stock in to these sort of like Ancestry.com DNA test. But we like it, right? We like these stories. We like to think that we're connected to some sort of greatness in a few generations back. We like these sort of family histories that get us to where we are today. So we like to think that we are one character in a larger sort of great, magnificent story. They provide coherence to the community, so we think things like we're all in this together. Every time a politician specifically uses the word we, I always pause and I always ask this question, like, who is the we? Like, what do you mean? Like, we're in this together, like we the people kind of stuff. Like politicians use the we a lot to be inclusive of everyone. But the fact of the matter is like clearly half the country doesn't agree with whatever politician is saying whatever thing, right? Because half the country votes Republican, half vote Democrat. I know it's not completely accurate, but stay with me here. So usually when a politician says we, they usually just mean like my team, like half of the country that agrees with like my policies. But all politicians use this sort of like we mentality, kind of try to bring in everyone together and create some sort of coherence. And it also creates a sense of what we call agreement. So politicians also use this phrase a lot, like the American people want. And again, it's half of the American people probably want that because half of the American people vote Democrat, half of the American people vote Republican. But politicians use this line a lot, right? Like I'm on the side of the American people, and sort of creates this it creates coherence and community, and it also creates agreement. It's like pulls you into it. Politicians are trying to pull you into their line of argument, and trying to get you to reject the other candidate as like that other candidate is so different than what we want as Americans, that you should reject that other presidential candidate, for instance. So there are all these little tricks that politicians try to do to sort of create this coherence of all of us sort of agreeing on the American story because they need a coalition in order to get the votes in order to win. All right. But this is what we're constantly doing. All right. Some other things that we want to think about is, what are some other American myths that hold America together? So we have these stories that we all learn in, second grade social studies, American history courses. George Washington, cut down a cherry tree and he couldn't tell a lie. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Right? We have these sort of mythical stories, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark kind of stuff. Now, here's the thing. Many of these things are exaggerated, or I guess some of them are probably outright false, right? I don't think that George Washington probably cut down a cherry tree. But myths don't necessarily mean false, right? Just because something is a myth, it doesn't necessarily mean it's false. It could just help us to understand that there's some sort of commonly held story or narrative that we are all trying to get on board with. As far as, to create a story that, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. It's like, here's a story, and I'm sure there was lots of other people involved besides just Paul Revere. This Midnight Ride of Paul Revere was sort of later retold in a poem, and that's how it became popularized. But it tries to hold us together around like what were we doing during the time of the Revolutionary War? How were we all pulling together? It creates this sort of larger story that, again, glue that holds us together. So what you want to think about some of these stories you were told. Realize that some of them are exaggerated, some of them are false, but again, it's trying to hold us together through storytelling. Now, outside of American myths, you can think of biblical stories in the same type of way. With regard to, like the book of Genesis would be a good one, right, where a lot of these sort of stories of like the creation stories are told. And they're trying to hold us together to sort of get us all on the same page with, why are we here on Earth? Like, where did we come from? Type of questions. So think about some of these questions that hold America together. Think of some of the questions that hold humanity together. And what myths and stories do we keep telling ourselves in order to, create coherence and try to get us to understand this idea of community. All right. What the job of a critic is, okay? So this is where you're going to come in with regard to your paper. You want to think about where do these myths come from, right? And then you want to find out why they're still powerful. All right, so you do want to separate myths from facts. Over here we have some, creation stories, or sort of like how the world is held up, on the back of a turtle, on the back of different animals, depending on, there's different cultures and religions that sort of have these creation myths as far as like where did the world come, especially when we used to think like the world was flat. It's like, okay, we're in this sort of like vast ocean of the universe and there's a turtle, right? The earth is we're on the back of a turtle and it's swimming through this sort of vast ocean of the universe kind of stuff. You want to figure out like where did this myth come from, right? Who first told it? Can you trace it back far enough? Are there earlier and earlier writings? So if you can trace it back far enough, then you can see how it might have changed or how it might have evolved. And we'll talk about this on the next section when we talk about 1001 Arabian Nights. As you go back further and further, you look for the evolution of the myth. Now, when we're talking about 2020, we see some of these myths are thousands of years old, and you say, well, why are some of these myths still powerful? In the realm of the creation story, if you will, for the United States, right? We have these sort of American Revolution. kind of stuff. You know, it's 250 years old, right? It's like, why are some of these stories still powerful? Like, why do we still hold on to them? What sort of coherence are we looking for with regard to sort of keeping America together? And politicians bring these things up every 4 years. Right now, it's October of 2020. We're only a couple weeks away from the next presidential election. You know, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are trying to sort of let you know that they are a part of this American story that goes back 250 years, and so they kind of keep bringing it up because the stories that we hold on to, as far as shining city on a hill, and equality, justice, fairness for all, ideas of liberty and civil rights. These are things that politicians keep bringing up, and like, we have to keep pushing forward and make sure that we're more and more inclusive, right? America is an idea, and we need to make sure that we fulfill the promise and all these other sorts of things. It's like people like these common themes, and they want to be reminded of them every 4 years, and politicians keep bringing up the past in order to get to the fantasy themes for the future. So that's where we're going to transition. All right. Fantasy themes are things for the future. So myths are about the past. Let's tell the story. All right. Fantasy themes are about the future. So it's shared vision for the future. So if we think of things like democracy, peace, prosperity, these are words that every politician is going to say. All right. If you look here, like, let's stick with politicians. They do things like, we want a brighter future, right? And they try to tell you all politicians have the exact same fantasy themes, right? They say, like, if you elect me, the future is going to be brighter. All your kids are going to be educated. Everyone's going to be safe and secure. Everyone's going to have more money. Like, freedom, justice, the American way kind of stuff. All politicians have the exact same, bucket full of words that they pull out because they know that that's what the American people want to hear. And what politicians are trying to get you to believe as the voter is that their policies are going to get us there. So the American people are held together by these sorts of fantasy themes, as far as brighter future. And what we argue about every 4 years, for the most part, is who should we vote for in order to get us to that brighter future of freedom and prosperity and equality, right? You're not going to go, there's no American voter you're going to go around to and find someone who disagrees with these sort of basic catch-all phrases, right? What you are going to find Americans disagree with on who should we vote for, who can get us to this place of, fairness and equality and justice for all and what have you, right? And a brighter future for our kids, all right? So that's what politicians are trying to do. They tell us a story about what the future can look like and what we as Americans want the future to look like. And then they say, and if you vote for me, I'll enact certain policies, and those policies are going to get us there. Outside of politics, all right, you can think of, basketball teams envisioning a championship at the beginning of the season, right? So they all get together and they say, who are we? This is our team. And you get, the coaches or maybe like the team captains to sort of help the rest of the team envision, this is where we're going this year. So if the team can buy into that vision of we're going to win a championship this year, and you have strong leadership, now all of a sudden that vision is going to be able to carry the team. If you don't have strong leadership, if you have a coach and a captain who's like, look, we're going to just be an average team this year. Sure, a championship would be nice, but we're probably not going to be able to get there, and they're very lackluster about their enthusiasm, then the rest of the team's not going to get on board as far as working hard. But if you can really get a coach and a captain to really buy into, we can be a championship team, that's going to bring everybody else, who's not a captain, everybody else on the team, that's going to bring them into the fold of trying to work harder and try to push the limits of, yeah, maybe we actually could win a championship. All right. Here has obviously, a terrible example, but people definitely do it. People who are, racist or bigoted, right? They want to create this sort of, segregated utopia, right? So they have a different fantasy theme for people who might hold on to their beliefs. And obviously these are awful, horrible beliefs, but there are, a few people out there who say, look, if you, enact our ideas, we can finally, live in, peace with one another, because, we need to have segregation. This is stuff that obviously was going on in the civil rights with people like George Wallace in the South, where you had that famous line about segregation today, segregation forever. And it was this idea that, people of different races can't live together. So in order to have, a peaceful existence, have this sort of utopia, we need to remain segregated. And that's what they pushed as far as like what's the best view of the future for America. And it's like, well, let's just split us all up and segregate us. So they were selling that vision. That vision was rejected. And the better angels prevailed, if you will. So one of the ways we can look at fantasy themes is through Martin Luther King Jr.'s MLK I Have a Dream speech. So Martin Luther King Jr. was very well known for using the myths of the American founding. So we have over here a quote where he says, I hope that the nation is going to rise up one day and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So he was using the myths of the founding and say, come with me, I'm going to carry you through the 1960s, the civil rights movement, so we can get to a future, this fantasy theme in the future, where I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of skin, but by the content of their character. So this is the future that he is envisioning for his kids, for his children, and for all of America's children. But it is rooted in this past of these myths from 250 years ago, from the founding. So Martin Luther King Jr., very well known for using the myths of the founding. He constantly brought them up to people who were against his movement, were against the civil rights movement, who were pushing back against the civil rights movement. And what he was doing was he would take the myths that everyone in the United States agreed on and would put it in people's face and say, this is what the Declaration of Independence says, this is what the Constitution says. I am just trying to point out that we should all be living up to the creeds that the founders sort of put down in the documents, the Constitution as well as Declaration of Independence. So these fantasy themes of living in a world, not judged by the color of skin, content of the character, but instead the content of the character. These are the fantasy themes that King was trying to sort of perpetuate forward, but they were based on the myths of the founding documents, of a founding that we all continue to recite, in elementary school. Okay, this gets into the next class period, but we're going to go ahead and get through it anyway because it has to do with cultural myths. 1001 Nights. Sometimes it's called Arabian Nights. Sometimes it's called 1001 Arabian Nights. What it is a large book of multiple stories. We'll talk about how it was produced here momentarily. But there's different versions of this book all around. It's a large collection of stories that has been put together over, that was put together over hundreds of years. And we're going to see how it has influenced our world today. So where do you know these stories today? Well, the story of Aladdin, for instance. So the story of Aladdin comes out of 1001 Arabian Nights. And there's lots of other stories that you all are familiar with. That come out of 1001 Arabian Nights. Now, the thing with 1001 Arabian Nights is that it, because it started off as an oral tradition and it took place in different areas throughout Persia, Middle East, is that different cultures changed, that the stories changed a little bit, right, over time. So obviously, the cartoon version of Aladdin isn't what you're going to find in a direct translation of 1001 Nights. However, the stories were changing anyways. So let's just talk about the beginning of 1001 Nights here. So I love the beginning of how this whole how these stories came to be doesn't change, and this sort of story of the collection of 1001 Nights I think is kind of incredible. All right. So you have this king, Sherar, right? I know it's a difficult name to say. Sherar, right? Sherar, right? He discovered that his queen had been unfaithful, and so he kills her, right? Pretty common theme, right? Amongst royalty, throughout the years across many different cultures. So this king finds out that his wife is unfaithful, so he has her killed. In that moment, he just decides that all women are horrible individuals, but he has to have a queen. So what he does is he starts to remarry one woman every day, and then he ends up killing them in the morning. So he's like, I have to have a queen, so we're going to have a wedding ceremony. I'm going to take this woman to bed, but because I have trust issues because of my first queen, I'm just going to kill her the next day. We're going to have another wedding, and it goes on and on and on like this. Eventually, his kingdom runs out of eligible maidens, right? So, young virgins for him to marry. But he has this political advisor, right? He has his right-hand man, if you will, has a daughter, and she's the only woman left in the kingdom that's an eligible maiden for the king to marry. But obviously, this political right-hand man of his is not too thrilled about his daughter marrying the king, right? Because he knows it's going to happen. So the vizier's daughter, her name is Scheherazade. Now, this is kind of cool. You all have heard the name before, right? Because the genie uses it in one of the songs in the movie Aladdin, right? So he says, he says, Ali Baba had his 40 thieves, Scheherazade had 1,000 tales, right? So this is one of the lyrics of Aladdin. So you all have heard this name before, right? And now you can go back and watch Aladdin and have a little bit more information as to where some of those lyrics came from. So you have this young girl, Scheherazade, and she says, no, Dad, I'll go ahead and marry him. I'll marry the king. I'm not worried about getting killed in the morning. And so you say, well, how does she avoid getting killed the following morning? Well, she does this cool little trick, right? She tells the king a story, right? But before he falls asleep, she leaves it as a cliffhanger. And she says, you know what? To be continued. I'm going to finish it the next night. So the king says, oh, I'm really interested in the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow her to live one more day. She'll finish up the story the next day. And then I'll kill her on the third day. The problem is Scheherazade is super crafty. And so the next night she goes ahead and she finishes the story. She finishes the story very quickly and begins to start another story immediately afterwards, and then she leaves another cliffhanger for him, right? So every night she's telling half of the story from the night before, and she's telling the half of the story that she's going to finish the next night, right? So you have 1,001 nights. So it's a collection of 1,001 stories. It's, again, it's an amalgamation of lots of stories. It doesn't, exactly equal 1,001. But it's just all these sort of very short adventure stories that she tells, and she just keeps leaving a cliffhanger, and the king allows her to continue to live. So this is her little trick in order to live, and it's fantastic, and it gets sort of put into this book called 1,001 Nights. So the stories date back to the 8th century. So this orange area in here is Persia, right? Also parts of India. If we get over into here, this gets into India. You can see Armenia here, which this means up here is Russia, the start of like Russia. I guess there's some of the stands right up in here. Let's see over here. Okay, we have Greece, right, and the Balkans. So this line right here kind of divides Europe and parts of Asia, right? So this whole Persian area, okay, down here in the Arabian Peninsula, we have like Saudi Arabia today. All right. So these stories were being told, right? So these are nighttime stories, right? These stories were being told over this vast swath of land for hundreds of years, and they were edited, combined into multiple versions. So I have a couple versions of Arabian Nights. Some of them are very short, right? So it's a few hundred pages of sort of the most sought at stories. I do have a collection where there's 3 volumes and they're 1,000 pages each, right? So it's a larger collection of all the stories put together. Yeah, so it's just an amalgamation, right? Now here's the interesting thing with regard to cultural stories. As people moved, right, and changed, right, over a course of a few hundred years, right, language evolves and the text was translated. So let's say that you're telling a certain story and you're down here on the coast of the Arabian Sea, right? And then you travel and someone tells that story and they're up here on the coast of the Caspian Sea. Well, if that story has a body of water, right, that's central to the story as far as, ships and trade and whatever, one version of the story might say, hey, the Arabian Sea, because it makes the people of that area feel like, oh, this happened in my home. Someone else up here near the Caspian Sea is going to have the Caspian Sea be the main body of water, right? The language might change. If you have common names, right? If you have names that are more common, down here in the Indus Valley, and different names are more common over here near the Black Sea, the names are going to change within the story. All right. So different areas within the Persian Empire are changing the stories a little bit. They're changing their names. They're changing who's in charge. Over the course of 100 years, the names of certain kings, right, the sort of celebrities of the day, they might substitute different names of the famous individuals who are central to the story. All right. But the core narrative, right, so the story of the king killing his wife and then eventually taking on Scheherazade to be the main narrator, this stays the same. All right. So this is how all versions of 101 Nights starts out. As the story moves throughout the Middle East, right, new cultures add their own twist, right, culture and religion. So I've talked a little bit about some of my classes with some of the reasons that the idea of cultural appropriation is far more complicated than what a Huffington Post article might make it out to be. And the reason is because cultures have been borrowing and stealing. You know, I'm even fine if you use the word stealing, but we've all been doing it with each other for, since the beginning of forever. One of the easy ways to think about this is the difference between the Greek and the Roman gods. They're all the same gods, right? It's the Greeks were basically in charge of the West before the year 0, right? Then you have Julius Caesar being assassinated, and you have some wars, and the Roman Empire starts up after the year 0, right? Or more or less, right? And the Romans said, look, we need to sort of get our foundations. We need to sort of stick our talons into the culture and let everyone know that Rome is in charge now instead of the Greeks. And everyone, they're like, oh, everybody likes these Greek gods, right? But we're Romans and we just don't like the name. So we're going to take Zeus. It's going to be the exact same god, and we're going to change his name to Jupiter. All right, so we're going to take Zeus. We're going to change him into Jupiter. We're going to take the Greek god Ares. It's going to be the same god of war, like this very manly god. We're going to change him into Mars. All right, so the Greek or the Romans did this with the Greek gods. Right, they just changed the names of the gods, but they kept the same stories about who these gods were. Right, so I mentioned this before. If you look up in the sky and you look at all the planets are named after the Roman god. So if you're ever concerned, if is it a Greek god or a Roman god? If it's named after a planet, it's a Roman, or if it named a planet, it's a Roman god. If you're unsure of it, it's probably a Greek god because they're a little bit more distant from us as far as as far as the timeline is concerned. All right. So cultures have been doing this all the time, right? There were cultures in and around Persia. Someone told these stories from 1001 Nights first, and then a different part of Persia, or maybe even into Greek and Rome, they got a hold of these stories and they're like, ooh, we kind of like these stories, but these stories are sort of closer to India, and in order to make them more interesting to the people of our culture, we're going to change a few things around. We're just going to tell the same story, but we're going to tell a different version of it, and we're going to give them names that are more like Greek names. If people in Greece were taking these stories and making them more interesting to their kids, it's like, okay, we're going to use a different body of water, we're going to use a different mountain range, we're going to use different names, but it's going to be essentially the same story, right? So as people traveled around, they just told slightly modified versions of the same stories in order to make them interesting to the culture in which they were in. All right. But the themes, right? The themes are the themes, right? These are all very sort of like the human experience type of themes. All right. So this is when we get into questions of like, what are the humanities for, right? The humanities are to sort of say, here's all the great art and literature and music that speaks to the human experience and continues to speak to the human experience and last generations, right? Things that are a blip on the map and then they go away. Like, that's probably not that canonical because it doesn't have that deep of a meaning. But when you take works of art that continue to last, you're like, this is interesting because this theme has lasted centuries and it is embedded in multiple cultures. All right, so some of the themes from 1001 Nights, again, these are like a collection of a ton of short stories, right? Obviously, the idea of God, you have different poetry, you have fantasy and magic, you do have horror, right? You have murder, crime, you have sex, but it's different versions of sex. So you have very passionate sex, you have romantic, right? Boy and girl fall in love. You have erotic, so you have this sort of like one night stand, like I need this person in my life for the evening, right? So it's very erotic love as opposed to long lasting romantic love. You have this sort of meaning of life, destiny, journey kind of stuff, which is also very present in things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which come more out of Greek culture, with the alleged writer Homer. All right. So these themes are present throughout 1001 Arabian Nights, and again, different cultures sort of take some of these stories and they sort of make them their own. Some other stories you're probably aware of. So I think that there was a cartoon version of this. I wasn't around for the cartoon version of Sinbad the Sailor, right? So again, you want to go on these adventure stories. Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. So one of the famous lines, right? Open Sesame, right? He's trying to sort of get into this hideout, and He's trying to figure out what the magical phrase is to open the door, and he finally goes through all these different trial and error, and eventually he says, "Open Sesame," and the door opens, right? So you all have probably heard this phrase, "Open Sesame," before, and this is where it comes from. It comes from 1001 Arabian Nights, the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And finally here, all right, you can look at the collection story. What does it tell us about myths and fantasy themes as far as holding the culture together? But you also look at, what does it influence in European and Western stories? So again, this is more Middle East out of Persia. But all of these authors, right, from James Joyce and Poe and Dickens and Rushdie and Lewis Carroll, right? Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland. Kipling wrote The Jungle Book, right? They have all cited 1001 Nights as having influence on their writing. All right, as far as adventure stories, which is more something like The Jungle Book. If we look at things like magic, right, and things that are impossible, you can look at stories like Alice in Wonderland. All right, so all these authors that we are more familiar with in the West cite this collection of stories as something that was influential to them. And again, even the Disney version of Aladdin, it's like, okay, that's not a direct translation from 1001 Nights, but someone over at Disney said, "Hey, 1001 Nights, this is a super cool book. There's a story in here about Aladdin and his magical lamp. Let's sort of make that interesting for an audience in, I guess it would have been like the 1990s." All right. So these stories, they change, but again, the sort of common underground, the foundational themes remain the same. Okay, all right, the very last part here, just a couple slides long. We're going to talk about Don Quixote, right? Which is this cultural story that shapes a lot of Spanish culture today. So Cervantes, who was around during the same time as Shakespeare, he wrote this story in 1605, and it sort of came out in multiple parts. It is seen as the first contemporary novel, all right? Yeah, okay, so here we go. The first modern novel in Western literature. As far as like the reading style, the themes, how it all came together as a novel, it's sort of seen as the first in sort of Western literature, right? So again, before this, you had a long oral tradition of stories. You had this sort of a lot of short stories kind of pieced together. Even if you think about the Bible is just several books kind of all stitched together, and then you say, okay, now we have this Bible, but it's like, okay, you have the book of Genesis and the book of this and the book of that and the book of whatever, right? 1001 Nights is just a bunch of short stories kind of stitched together. Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare was writing plays and sonnets, so even his things weren't sort of in novel form, okay? What Don Quixote is about, which we've talked about a little bit in on a different subject matter when we're talking about this idea of style, the buddy cop movie kind of stuff. All right, it's a man who gets swept up in reading books. He decides that he wants to be a knight, right? A knight errant, they call them, but he just wants a life of adventure, right? And he goes around and he fights foes, and even though he has to sort of make them up in his head, and he's always saving the damsel in distress. So it's a call to adventure story for someone where adventure isn't very present in his life. Don Quixote is sitting around in his house reading a lot of books, and he wants to go out and he wants to be that heroic guy, all right? So some things you can think about is like, have you ever gotten swept up in a book and then proceeded to mimic that book, or a movie, right? Has there ever been some movie that you watched that was so influential on you that you just wanted to kind of be that character? Now, hopefully now, most of you in your early 20s, hopefully you've put some of that stuff away. But when you're younger, it's like, little kids watch the Avenger movie and then they say, I'm Superman, I'm Spider-Man, I'm Batman, I know all these people aren't Avengers because DC and Marvel, but you get the point, right? You watch a superhero movie and, you want to sort of put on that costume, right? What myths and fantasy themes might be present in Don Quixote, right? Again, this call to adventure, like he envisions himself as this knight who is going to go win the heart of the damsel in distress. But he also has these myths because they're found in these books, and he reads these myths about who are heroic people, right? What makes a heroic person? He translates that into himself, and then he goes out and he has this fantasy vision for the future. Just a couple pictures that come out of the book. So here's a picture of this might be his mom or possibly the maid of the house. There's multiple people who get together after he leaves. This happens very early in the novel. After he leaves and everyone's like, where did Don Quixote go? they find out that they find all these books in his room, and they're just kind of like, we're going to burn the books because they have given him bad information about the life that he needs to live. Over here we have the windmills, which is a famous scene where he sees these windmills off in the distance. He thinks that they're giants, so he's going to go and fight these giants, but really he's just fighting windmills. And over here he's staying at this local inn, and he starts fighting. He sort of envisions that there are these bad men in the inn that he's staying at, but they're just sacks of wine, like they're not actual people. And he starts, you know, fighting and opening all these bags of wine with his sword. All right. What we think about Spanish culture, this is actually this one above the red line. This is me in Madrid. So you have this giant statue of Don Quixote, and then his little sidekick here, Sancho Panza. I don't have behind them, at least twice as big as these statues, is this big statue of Cervantes, the author of the story. So this is a huge monument in the middle of Madrid, where you're like, this is a prominent, enormous monument in the middle of Madrid. It might be the biggest monument in all of Madrid. It's the biggest one that I saw in Madrid. So you're like, clearly Cervantes and the book Don Quixote is extremely powerful in Madrid. If you walk around Madrid or Barcelona, you're going to see paintings and murals and mosaics and you're going to see Don Quixote everywhere. Now you're going to see him in the souvenir shops, right? But you're just going to see him, like, pictures of him in restaurants, right? Like Don Quixote and Cervantes are everywhere. This is a statue of Cervantes in Toledo, which was is like the oldest. It used to be the capital of Spain. But this is a very old city. Here is what it looks like, and yeah, it's pretty small, easy to walk around. But yeah, I mean, it looks like this medieval times castle community. But there's just a big statue of Cervantes in the middle of Toledo as well. So you go around Spain and you just kind of keep seeing the same guy, Cervantes, pop up. You see, and then his character Don Quixote popping up, and you say, what is it about, Cervantes that is so powerful in Spanish culture? And it's like, okay, well, maybe this book has something that is important and foundational to Spain, and maybe I should learn about Don Quixote. Maybe I should read Don Quixote, and now all of a sudden I'm going to have a better understanding of Spanish culture, or at least I'll be able to walk through the streets and I'm going to see these murals and these statues and these monuments and everything else, and that's going to give me a better understanding, right? So imagine if people travel to the United States, right, on holiday, they're going on vacation, they're walking around Washington D.C. Like before they walk around Washington D.C., right, if they're not American citizens, if they're coming here to visit or on vacation, it's like you should give them, they should read a little bit about the Constitution, the Declaration, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, and they should read some short biographies and learn about these individuals. That way, when they walk around Washington D.C., they see these monuments. All of a sudden, they have a better understanding of what they're looking at, right? Clearly, those individuals had a huge influence on American culture. Clearly, Cervantes and his character Don Quixote have a huge influence on Spanish culture as far as what they put out there, as far as public murals and public monuments. All right, so this is what we're talking about. What stories influence your culture? All right, myths. What stories in the past influence and shape your culture? Right, and then what stories is your culture telling today with regard to where they want to go in the future? Right. And creating these cohesive stories to keep a culture together. A culture can't hold together if we don't agree on the past, and a culture can't hold together if we don't agree on what are the values that we need to coalesce around in order to get to where we want to get in the future. If we have different values, right, we're not going to be able to move together in the future. Now, we have different policies, right? Like we vote, like Democrat, Republican, right? We vote for different presidential candidates as far as whose policies are going to get us there. But for the most part, right, so far we've done a pretty good job for 250 years in the United States of holding together around shared values, right? Now, if we start to disagree on the values as far as fantasy themes for the future, now all of a sudden we might not be able to hold together in the future. But if we can at least agree, like, these are the things that we all want together as far as moving forward in the future, these fantasy themes, we'll disagree on the policies that get us there, but we can kind of keep coalescing around, equality, justice, freedom, on and on and on, right? But that's what we need to hold together, right? And we also need to have this sort of shared understanding with the past. And again, the details of the past get muddy. Historians argue about the past, but there are certain things about the past that we can coalesce around, right? And we go back to those MLK speeches where, in his I Have a Dream speech, he's like, I want to hold America's, this is what he's saying in the civil rights movement in the 60s, I want to hold America's feet to the fire and say, look, the United States of America, you held up the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and you said, all men are created equal. It's like, I want to hold your feet to the fire and make you live up to that creed, right? But that's the creed that we agreed on in, let's say, 1776 and then 1787 with the Constitution. That's what we agreed on. I'm going to hold your feet to the fire, and that's the direction we're going to go. Finally, here with Don Quixote, it asks some questions with regard to, is chivalry dead, right? This idea of sort of like living this manly life, saving a damsel in distress. It does have themes of burlesque and carnivalesque, which is exaggerations, which we learned a little bit about in Com Theory in the spring, if you've hung out with me there. Ideas of romance and nihilism, right? So living a romantic life is sort of constantly seeking the sense of adventure. That's who Don Quixote is. Nihilism is just, nothing matters and we might as well take our toys and go home because it's all going to burn to the ground anyway, right? And all of us are always fighting this tension throughout life, right? So we shouldn't be dismissive of the fact that there are some times when we all slip into nihilism. There are moments when we all slip into this idea of nothing really matters. What's the point what's the point of doing this? So there's a tension that goes on in all of us all the time as far as should we go and seek out adventure, or what's the point of, doing anything, right? And this is what, this is a tension that we can kind of see being explored throughout Don Quixote. We also have ideas of the hero and the anti-hero. So are any of us really heroic, or is it just all in our heads? Do we make up stories about who we are as far as, being heroic individuals, or do we sort of elevate ourselves and our importance a little bit higher than it needs to be? Over here, I remember this from when I was a young kid. I don't know how many episodes they made, but there was a cartoon on Saturday mornings called Don Quixote, and his sidekick was Sancho Panda, which was kind of fun. All right, so this was sometime in, I don't know, 1980s, 1990s. I watched it a little bit when I was growing up, but I don't really know where you can find the episodes anymore. I don't know how long it lasted, but there was a cartoon version of this. Finally, your cultural myth paper, all right? And I'm going to make this quick. There are instructions online, the full version, but let me explain real quick, okay? Find a cultural myth and analyze its qualities of myths and fantasy themes, all right? Pick only one myth, all right? Find something interesting that has some history behind it, okay? So do not pick a myth that was just started 50 years ago. Find something that's been around for a while, all right? And you can pick it from any culture that you want, okay? So go find some sort of myth, a legend, a story that is central to some culture in the world that's been around in that culture for a long time. Look for a myth that has lasted centuries within a culture, and look for a myth that's outside your nation of origin, right? So if you're an American, right, look for something. Don't look for George Washington cut down a cherry tree and couldn't tell a lie. Go find something new. All right, go explore a culture and a myth from a culture that you are not a part of. Okay. Find at least 3 scholarly sources. We've talked about this many times. I don't want to repeat myself, right? These are going to be books from the library that summarize the myth, right? And they're going to give you some background about the culture. So if you find a myth that is very present in Indian culture, right, you're going to have to go and find some history books on India, right? You might have to find some religious books on Hinduism, okay? Yeah, if it's about a culture's religion, to better understand the myth, cite some sources that give me some information about the religion. Cite some sources that explain the myth. Chances are you did not create the myth, so somebody else did, so give them credit for it. Okay, so go and find information about where that myth comes from. Tell me about the myth. Tell me how long it's been in that culture. All right, so what you're doing is you're writing a paper, more in a longer version than what I just told you as far as the information on 1001 Nights. It's like 1001 Nights, it's from Persia, 8th century, amalgamation of a few different myths. Here's a summary of it with the king and Scheherazade and her telling him the stories. And here's some of the stories from 1001 Nights. You're going to do that, but in a more academic, cite your sources kind of way. All right. You might have one source that talks about myths and fantasy themes as academic terms. So you might find a textbook somewhere in the library that talks about what myths is. You can cite your textbook. All right, make sure you cite it correctly. 3 parts. Introduce thesis, main points. This should say part 2, not part 3. Part 2, because your conclusion is part 3. Part 2, briefly summarize and mostly analyze the myth. I'm not interested in you telling me the entire myth. I'm interested in what that myth says about the culture. So what are the key points of the myth? What are the themes? What are the overall lessons from the myth? right? So it's like George Washington. It's like cut down a cherry tree, don't tell a lie. It's like we want to tell our second graders, and like, don't lie, right? What does the myth say about the cultural values, attitudes, and beliefs? So if you did something out of the Bible, it's like, okay, you know, Jesus has all these parables. These are stories that are around for a long time. What does that say about if everybody in the culture mostly understands these parables of Jesus? What does that say about the ways in which, you know, we're supposed to live? How the culture is supposed to live as far as in the future with fantasy themes, right? You don't have to answer all the questions, just the ones that are pertinent to you, right? So these things are just meant to get you thinking about the myth. Don't cut and paste images into your paper. I can find them. And then finally, the conclusion: evaluate the myth in about one page. What can other cultures learn from the myth? Does the myth have a theme? I'm covering it up the rest of this term here, right? Does the myth have a theme that can transcend cultures, right? So if you find some sort of myth out of India, but then you realize like this myth out of India is very similar to a myth in the Bible, right? Okay, now we can figure out like this story transcends different cultures. Like there's something interesting here where different cultures have similar topics of exploration with regard to the myths and the fantasy themes they are circulating within their culture. All right, that's your cultural myth paper. That's the entire discussion for this week on this idea of cultural criticism. Myths and fantasy themes, know the difference, and again, start diving into the art and the literature of a culture that is long-lasting and stable, all right? Pop culture's fun, I get it, but that stuff is just a blip on the radar, and it's going to be gone tomorrow, all right? The pop culture that I grew up with, right, in the late 90s, early 2000s, like all of those like musical artists, like they're all gone now, right? But there is art and there's literature and there is music that has been around for centuries. That's going to be around for centuries to come. All right. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about cultural myths and fantasy themes. Is what are those hard fought canonical text and pieces of art that are lasting. All right. That's what you want to look at. Okay. That's all I have. We will talk about. We'll bring up this discussion in a couple weeks when I see you again on Zoom.